Welcome back, everybody. We're now ready to move on to the social construction of sexual orientation. As we'll see, defining sexual orientation in our culture depends first on defining gender. And if our definition of gender is called into question, then so is our understanding of sexual orientation. This is that foundation of sand we talked about when learning about phenomenology and social constructionism. Just like with gender, it's easier to see sexual orientation as a social construction by comparing how it's done in different cultures. Again, if it's done differently from one culture to another, or from one time period to another, we know it's socially constructed. So, let's start with our own culture. In our culture, sexual orientation depends on the gender of other people, the people we're attracted to. And this system is based on ancient Greek ideas regarding sexuality. In our society, scientists have divided people up based on attraction. Heterosexuality refers to those who are physically attracted to people of the opposite sex, while homosexuality refers to those who are physically attracted to people of the same sex. I should point out, however, that these terms are rather clinical, and they refer to nothing but attraction and sexual behavior. The way that people identify is different. So, for example, there are parallels for each of these terms that better capture the way people identify, including straight, gay, or lesbian. Again, this dualistic model of sexual orientation categories can be traced all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Plato, in the Symposium, explains the origins of these categories in a creation story that is similar to, and yet very different from, the creation story presented in the book of Genesis. We'll take a look at that story during class. But for now, it's important to note that this Greek-based system distinguishing between heterosexuality and homosexuality presents us with yet another dichotomy, or binary. Such a system doesn't account for bisexuality. Bisexuality refers to those who may be attracted to members of either sex. Fast forwarding to the early 1900s, Sigmund Freud theorized that everyone is born bisexual, and that it is only as we grow up and mature that most people focus their sexual attraction and behavior on those of the opposite sex. His thinking on homosexuality seems to be undecided. Whether he thought it was a pathological psychosexual development or not varied over time and in different places in his writing. However, as we'll see with the topic of stigmatization, the dominant view in the field of psychology until the mid-1970s was that any sexuality other than heterosexuality was pathological and designated as a mental illness. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Alfred Kinsey conducted groundbreaking research on sexuality based on a large sample of the US population. Over 8,000 people participated in a study, and he concluded that sexual orientation is better conceived of as a continuum. As you might imagine, his reports, as well as his books on men's and women's sexuality, were highly controversial at the time. Based on his analysis of the data, he created what is known as the Kinsey scale, which looks like this. Kinsey thought of sexual behavior as ranging on a continuum, so his scale ranges from 0 on the left to 6 on the right, with a 0 representing an exclusively heterosexual orientation based on sexual behavior, and a 6 representing an exclusively homosexual orientation, again based on behavior. A person who is identified as a Kinsey 3 is a person who is equally likely to engage in sexual behavior with men as with women. However, anyone with a Kinsey 1 through 5 would fall within the bisexual category as it is more commonly understood. He found that approximately 10% of males and 6% of females had an almost exclusively homosexual orientation based on their sexual behavior. In addition, 37% of males and 13% of females had engaged in same-sex sexual behavior to the point of orgasm. Of these, about 25% indicated that their experiences with same-sex sex were confined to experimentation during adolescence. But notice that his study focused on sexual behavior. Current research poses a far more nuanced understanding of sexuality. It separates out homosexual desire, behavior, and identity. Instead of focusing exclusively on sexual behavior, this model also takes into account sexual desire as well as how a person self-identifies. Notice that it is set up as a Venn diagram in which these three dimensions overlap. But this also highlights that for many people, their desires, behaviors, and identities don't always line up. In other words, we're much more complicated than a simple binary view or even a continuum of sexuality would have us believe. In class, we'll examine the data for where people end up in this multidimensional model of sexuality. For now, returning to how the categories have been laid out in our society, what I find particularly interesting about the bisexuality box is that many straight people, and even gay and lesbian people, especially those of older generations, are not all that comfortable with those who identify as bisexual. Just like with gender, this seems to be a result of how deeply embedded dualistic thinking is in our culture. Basically, the bisexuality box disrupts our dualistic way of thinking. It doesn't fit our preferred either-or model, and that weirds many people out. On the one hand, those who identify as bisexual are seen as sexually deviant by unaccepting straight people, just like gay and lesbian people are. At the same time, however, they may be seen as cop-outs by unaccepting gays and lesbians who think they just want the best of both worlds, or they're just experimenting, or they just haven't finished coming out of the closet yet. So, bisexual people face prejudice from both directions, which puts them in a position in which they're oftentimes forced to choose one of the other boxes as their, quote, real sexual identity, because bisexuality doesn't fit into our scheme of dualistic categories. There are other sexual orientations that can't be accounted for by this more binary approach we inherited from the ancient Greeks. For example, there are people who identify as asexual, meaning that a person doesn't experience sexual attraction or desire to partner for the purposes of sexual stimulation, or may simply be disinclined towards sexual behavior or sexual partnering. There's also the pansexual category, in which a person desires sexual partners based on personalized attraction to specific physical traits, bodies, identities, and/or personality features, which may or may not be aligned to the gender and sex binary. In other words, this is a person who has potential emotional, physical, and/or sexual attraction to any sex, gender identity, or gender expression. And of course, there are even more options out there, all of which challenge our binary understanding of sexual orientation stemming from the original Greek model based on attraction. In fact, as we'll see, a person's sexuality doesn't have to be determined by attraction at all. Stay tuned and we'll learn more about that.